guys who are here. I'm really glad that it's these people, my family and some of my closest friends and people who I was around but didn't know until I came back from the last time I was in Australia. And so I'm really glad that this room is filled with you all who I'm comfortable with and willing to I just want to tell you what God has been up to in my life. And so that's probably what Brian was referring to when he said he got to know me so quickly, was just, I want people to know the crazy things that I've been able to experience in these it's only been 16 months, but the changes that have taken place, I'm taken back by all of it, and so I just want to share that with all of you. And so I'll share a little bit about it, a little bit about what has happened 16 months in the past up to this day, which was first as a student in Australia, doing missionary work, and then just in 2019, it has been as a staff member with the same organization, and then tell you what's coming next as well. And because I find that a lot of people actually have no idea what I'm doing, hence dessert night, I'm glad you're all here. And I hope I can give some understanding about the specifics, but also the huge overview of what has been going on. So thank you for being here. It's really special to me. So what I have been doing, really broadly to start, is I've been with a missionary organization called YWAM, Youth with a Mission, particularly in Townsville, Australia, which is on the east coast of the country. And it's a YWAM base, and many of you are probably familiar with or have heard of YWAM. This one has some differences from other YWAM bases, which I will tell you about somewhere in the middle of the night. So we can get into it, but the reason Brian said he felt like he could get to know me so quickly is because I think I've just been really released to be vulnerable with people and to tell you what has happened. And so maybe many of you have heard or have read about just the blatant things that I went through and have gone through since, but I'll rehash it tonight. And I just want to tell you the truth of what has happened in my life personally. And so to get an idea of the sort of transformation that I'm talking about, that I've experienced inside my own heart, you'd have to understand where I was starting from. And from the exterior, it was probably fine. The life that I was living was probably fine. It looked like a lot of different people in my life, similar to them, and maybe even like a fairly successful version of what I'm talking about. So I was start when I was 17 years old. I thought life had a little bit more than what I was currently experiencing, and I'm sure that everyone has felt this same like hole inside of themselves that it was meant to be filled and not stay empty. And so I'm speaking super vaguely. Of course, all of you can experience that to some extent, and it can be due to one thing or due to another. And I didn't know what it was due to, but I did know the things that I had already tried to fill it with at the age of 17 years old. And so I'd tried to fill this hole that I knew meant to be filled with, well, I went to church every week for 20 years before I decided to go to YWAM. So if I went once a week, it was about 1,000 times that I had attended church, but probably at certain stages in my life it was 2 or 3. So I've been to church a lot, and I still have this hole in my heart, so clearly it's not church that's meant to fill this hole. That's obvious at this point. And I've also tried just being like a model kid, getting good grades. I did get pretty good grades, and so there was having fun. That was left. I'll try that. And so I did have some fun. And it does feel like it's starting to fill this hole that all of you can relate to, but of course never comes close to satisfaction, or destiny is another word that people would use for this. And so if it wasn't church and it wasn't having fun, at least that I had experienced thus far, then what was it? And I decided it would be Ian. Ian will fill this hole in my life. Ian was the one thing I had control over. And so I wanted to change Ian in as many ways as possible to set myself up to look like the Ian that was necessary to fill that hole. And so the first way that I started doing this was bodybuilding. I started lifting weights casually at first, and then people patted me on the back and said I was doing great. And so I've put a lot of pride and identity in lifting weights and changing my body image into the way I thought that it should be. And I was successful at it. I did well at it. And that's fine and dandy, and it felt like that hole was beginning to be filled a little bit, but when it wears off, you have to find the next thing that's going to be added to that first thing in order to continue this progress of finding the satisfaction. And so other things that I would do would be a model son and just get good grades and be respectful to my parents, or a number of other little things, but I realized I could do all of these things. I could get good grades, I could continue to get more fit while I was high. So I smoked a lot of weed at this stage in my life. I was it started out pretty irregular to smoke marijuana, and then it was probably before I left for Australia 5 or 6 days a week, and it was just normal to me. I could play it off. If I didn't want you to know that I was high, then you probably didn't know, and I was still living a life that I thought was eventually going to fill this hole that I thought I deserved to have it filled. And so these number of small things that I've named off in order to find this fulfillment, guess what? Didn't work, which is fine. There are bigger things in life. So I went for some of those bigger things, and world traveling was a small piece of that. And I saw my friends doing it and having a great time, and I thought, oh, that looks easy enough for me to not only have fun, but also show people that I'm this adventurous person who wants to not be held back by fear or boundaries. And I think all of that is great. And so I jumped into that a little bit, went to several countries and accomplished those things I just named, but, of course, then what's next? And so probably in my mind, the biggest trip that I was going to go on, which was actually a big turning point in my life, was with a couple of my friends. I was going to meet them in northern Vietnam. And we have a little bit of experience on motorcycles. And so if you can picture it, land in Vietnam, and I'm on this Honda XR 150 that we rented, driving through these windy passes of northern Vietnam with the border of China on our right and an adventure directly in front of us after we dodged the yak in the road. And I was doing something that other people don't really do that often. And I thought that I was accomplishing these goals that I had set out for myself. Make Ian the person who I think that he should be. And as I'm floating through these mountain pass trails and admiring the culture and the nature all around me and being that person who I thought that I was setting myself up to be, I was floating all of a sudden. Specifically like floating through the air. I had slammed on the brakes on my motorcycle going 50 miles an hour and went over the front of the handlebars. And there's witnesses in this room to confirm it. And if I had landed on the ground, maybe I would have tumbled and broken my wrist or some minor bones. It could have been a little messy, but when I hit the ground, my motorcycle pinned me, and I just slid. And really quickly, I reoriented myself, and I was like, okay, this is what just happened. Now I'm here. I'm still sliding. I'm still going 20 miles an hour on the pavement, and I'm not being chewed up by. This is best case scenario. This is incredible, and if this wasn't incredible, if this had gone any other way, potentially, death might be unrealistic, but it showed me just like how precious this life can be, because it was just presented to me right there that I'm not really in control. A stray moped caused me to crash, and a stray car on Silverton Road could kill me today. It's not really up to me. And so I had been asking myself this question the whole time, where I'm trying to build up Ian, whether I was in Vietnam or in Silverton. I was asking this question like, are these things actually going to add up to what I feel like this hole needs to be filled with? And so when I realized that I was in the middle of the biggest attribute to making Ian who I wanted him to be, it was almost all lost. I felt very out of control. And there was this inkling on my heart. I got back home to Silverton, and I just knew that it needed to be something totally different. Something totally different that I was going to be up to next in life. I needed like a blank start. And so not many people know this, but I was in Main Street Bistro. They're on the main street with the hometown I grew up in to the left through the windows and my laptop in front of me, and I was about to restart. I was filling out an application to teach English as a second language in Vietnam because it sounded exciting. Again, it sounded like something that other people weren't doing, and people would say, oh, Ian's living an adventurous life, but at the same time, I had freshness to start with, and I could just pretend like certain things didn't happen or make myself exactly who I wanted to be this time, which was a big difference. And so I finished that application, and then I just paused. And I opened a new tab in the corner of my computer, and I typed in, what am I supposed to do with my life? Google search. And 60 seconds later, I had already begun to fill in my information for not just a YWAM application, but specifically in Townsville, Australia. It's beyond me. And I closed the laptop and I went home. Maybe 48 hours later, my phone rang, and the area code was +61. Couldn't have possibly recognized that, but I bet all of you in this room could have guessed. It's Australia. Australia was calling my phone, and I said, hello, and good day, mate. A lovely man named Lloyd was on the other side of the phone, and he said, you've just filled out an application to do discipleship training school with YWAM in Australia, right? And I said, yeah, I did. That's what that was. Yes. And so he proceeded to explain to me what that meant and what those 5 months would be spent doing. Very vaguely speaking, the first half of the 5 months is a lecture phase, and so guest speakers from around the world come to explain to you and teach you out of the Bible relative to what a life in the mission field would look like. And then the second half, you get to put all of that into practice. And you get to go to communities that either desire to be sharing with this information you've received, or to serve them with physical needs, or a variety of things. And so I said, it sounds like an adventure. It sounds like something no one else is doing. Kind of sounds like a reset. Okay. Mom, going to Australia. And I decided really quickly that, okay, that's what it'll be. It's kind of less commitment with all the same benefits as teaching English as a second language, potentially easier, except for I don't make money, I pay money. That's a little backwards. Anyways, I decided it was time to go, but I'm really thankful for the people in my life truly want the best for me. And that looks different ways depending on who the person is, but I really trust that the people in my life desire good for me. And so one of my friends asked a really simple question because he cares about me, and he said, why are you going? And I did have to think because it didn't make sense. I had lived a life saying, oh, I believe in Jesus as God. That's the life that I spoke, but my actions didn't line up with any of that. If I believe in a man who came to earth and then died and changed the whole world and there's heaven waiting for me after, then my actions are telling you that I don't actually believe that. And so when he asked me why I'm doing this, I really had no answer, and so I was shaken to the bone. And I got on a plane like that. And I spent more than a day traveling across the world, shaking in my shoes because I was doing something that made no sense to me, and I was quite afraid. And to be perfectly honest with you, the biggest thing in question was not my decisions. It was, for the first time in my life, I'm really facing this idea of, there's a good chance I don't believe God is real. There's a very good chance of that. It was teetering on the 50% line, and I don't even know why it was that high. So I get to this place, and right away I probably want to leave. I'm thinking about what it would be like to just take the tuition that you guys and myself all helped me raise in order to go to Australia, and then just spending that to backpack for a while and see some sights. I mapped out in my mind what that might look like. But then I got to the base, and I met some of the first people, and I met Lloyd, and several people who are just really lovely. And it had nothing to do with religion or anything at this point, but I was like, this is a good place. So I'll stick around for this one reason, because I don't want to spend my life teetering over this 50% line. Do I believe it and therefore have that guilt and shame so that my life can look the way that I think it's supposed to look? Or do I not believe it? And that was a big question for me. And I said, okay, so here on day 2, I'm just going to make a decision. I'm going to be completely present and in search of truth. For this whole 5 months, I won't be goofing off or just trying to go on adventures when the focus is actually meant to be on studying or serving other people. I will do the most to get out of the way and let God, if he's willing to, do what he wants to do at this time. And so the lecture phase begins, and of course, if God would just show me he was real, then the rest of it would be easy, right? If I could just see it visually in a way that I can't deny anymore, then that doesn't just mean one truth, it means the whole Bible is truth. And you can't change a word of it, and so there I have my whole worldview in a leather-bound book. And so if I could just see God show me that he was real, that's what I was looking for at this point. And so they presented me with a great opportunity to do that, because week 1 of discipleship training school was hearing God's voice. Perfect. If God speaks to me, then, he's real, and that was really easy. And it's on the first week, no problem. Like, this is going to be a good time. One way or another, I'm going to find truth really quick. And then disclaimer, the teacher says, you won't hear it with your eardrums, but rather like in your thoughts. And I'm just like, okay, it makes sense. I'm not discrediting it, but there goes my immediate response, my immediate decision-making response. And so we do this thing, which sounds a little weird, and we practice hearing God's voice. And so what it looks like is we sit in the classroom, just a little room and circles of 8 people on the ground sitting crisscross applesauce, not holding hands, and we pray and say, well, God, what do you have to say to me? And so we practiced this week 1. And we said, God, we would like to hear from you, specifically so that we're all praying about the same thing. We were praying for the youth precinct building, which I'll continue to talk about as this story unfolds. The youth precinct was just a building somewhere in Townsville that Youth with Mission there in Townsville was considering purchasing to use it as another ministry location. And so that's all the information they told us. There's this property, pray about that, and then just tell us, after you've taken some time for God to reply to you, what was in your head. And so it might be really hard to tell if it was you or him, and so it doesn't matter. Just tell us what was there, and potentially it made no sense to you, but the person on the other side of the room has another piece of information, and together it makes sense. And so I said, okay, it's ridiculous, and I've gone to over 1,000 church services and never heard this concept before, but I had decided to get out of the way and just see if God wanted to do something. And so I did, and I sat there, and I prayed, God, do you have anything to say about the youth precinct building? And I zoned out for several minutes until it was reconvened, and they said, okay, what did you hear God say about the youth precinct building? And the first person said, I was just reminded of this scripture from this chapter in the Bible. And they said, that makes a lot of sense. I can see how that relates to this building. Cool, we'll write it on the whiteboard and keep track of what everybody has heard from God. And the next person, I specifically remember, she said, when I asked God about the youth precinct building, I just could picture in my head a greenhouse. And so I think that this will be a place where young people are planted and grow roots, and then are in this environment that really helps them grow quickly and strong. And that stuck with me. And then it was my turn to tell them what was in my head. And really, truly, I had just zoned out for 4 minutes. I was thinking about nothing, but then they said, well, your head was empty. And they're right. So what was I zoning out about? In the top right corner of blackness was a green frog. And then to the left of it, a white feather floated down past it. And I probably would have forgotten this, just like you forgot what you dreamt about last week. But they wrote it on the board, so visually I can still see it was written in the top right corner of the whiteboard. Ian, frog, white feather to the left, and we moved on. It didn't correlate with the person on the other side of the room. Didn't really matter. And then the following week, we were going to do it again. And they chose the same topic, the youth precinct building. And so what will God have to say about the youth precinct as we ask him this time? And this time we sat in a circle, crisscross applesauce, not holding hands. But we had a piece of paper in the center. And so you could immediately, if something was in your head that you thought might be relevant, you can write it on the piece of paper. And so I zoned out. That's all I did. And then I was like, oh, there was just something there. What was that? And so I drew it, what I had just seen, on the piece of paper in front of me, and it was this. I'm a missionary, not an artist. If you can use your imagination, it's the silhouette of a person in front of the sun. And I just drew it. It was the first thing on the paper. It was in my head, and then it was physically in existence because of my pencil. And then Lloyd, this lovely Australian guy who had spoken to me on the phone, he was now leading the whole school, the whole DTS, and a great friend of mine. And he was sitting right next to me and said, that actually kind of looks like a painting that's on the precinct. And I said, whoa, maybe I'm hearing God's voice. But I wasn't interested enough to follow up on it or anything like that, so more weeks went by. So I've been in Australia for more than a month now, battling this, I have no idea what I believe. And that was extremely difficult for me. I felt like a leaf in the wind, blown this direction or that direction, depending on the day, depending on feelings. And I just was hungry to know what was true. And so about 4 weeks into this difficult adventure in Australia, Lloyd, myself, and several other men went for a walk at sunset. And we exited the door to the base and turned right. And Lloyd said, as we go on a walk, like, we're just going to pray for each other and for this community and just lift these things up to God. And I figured we could go actually check out the youth precinct building as well and walk in that direction. And we said, that sounds like a great idea. And I remembered that he had just said that my drawing a few weeks ago looked like something there. So I was curious. And so we turned onto the street, and something caught my eye in the top right corner. As I walked down the street, there's a water tower and a cliff with a big green frog, kind of at the top right. And then bottom left, you can see a white building, and this was our destination. And so we walked closer, and it was getting dark. This is kind of a sketchy part of town, but we were at the end of our little short walk, and I remembered what I had drawn. It looked a little bit like this. And then I'm under the frog, and I'm facing this main wall, and there's another painting right in front of me, and it was this. And there's a white dove, which reminds me of a feather down to the bottom left of the frog, staring me in the eye. And so I didn't repent or anything like that at this moment. I freaked out a little bit. I freaked out a lot. And I wanted to go back, and so we did. I was uncomfortable. That's a weird painting. And it was nighttime in a sketchy part of town, and I was like, I'm getting out of here. And so several days later, after processing this and looking at these paintings again and saying, how can I reconcile this many coincidences? So I'm praying to God, talk to me about this building, this physical place that I've never been to before, and these seemingly random things come into my mind, and then I am now standing in this physical place for the first time that I've been praying about, and I see all of the things that God has spoken to me about. And it hit me. 3 days later, I was back on that property, and it hit me. He's been trying to get my attention. And so I did repent and say, sorry, Jesus, I have been standing against you for maybe my whole life. And I just want to say to you, God, like, I hear you. I acknowledge that this is not something I could have constructed myself, like, I get it. And to mark this and to drive a stake into the ground, I just want to say, I'll never smoke weed again. This is something I've been debating whether it's good for me or not anyways, and I feel a little bit of conviction about it. And so just to mark this and to say, yes, I did hear your voice, God, and I want to find out what that's about. I drove that stake into the ground and committed to never ingest THC, to make it really clear, no marijuana for the rest of my life. And ever since, it's been really easy, but it's just a thing of the past now. And so this was a time for me. This was a really specific experience, and it wasn't everything. I wasn't just on a spiritual high after this. I was just like, that was a time where God replied. You know, he told me he was there, and he's been faithful even though I'm just faithless. And so it reminds me of this verse, 2 Corinthians 3:16. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. And so finally, God led me to this place where I was able to be taken out of God's way. It was just revelation from him. It's nothing that I did that brought me to this place, but the veil is taken away. And so the Bible talks a lot about you can't see it if your heart isn't in a position to see it. And so many truths about God had just been completely disguised to me. And they started to make a lot of sense after I told God, whoa, I was in the wrong. And so the rest of DTS is built on top of this story. The rest of those 5 months are just more things that God kept doing. And this is something I got to continually go back to as kind of the starting point of when that all started, which is really special to me. And so that youth precinct building that I've been talking about, actually 8 months after that, so January of 2019, Youth with Mission in Townsville purchased that property, and we've been renovating it. It's fully operational now as accommodation, and pretty soon it will be opened. Maybe it'll take until next year, but we'll have, it's like a third place, you know? So your kids can go home or to school as their first and second places, but they need a place that isn't either of those so that they can be in a community of people like them, and sometimes that ends up being, it was the skate park for me at a certain stage in my life, and that was pretty innocent for me, but oftentimes you're surrounded by the wrong crowd in certain settings, and so this youth precinct can be many, many different things for many people, and the suicide rate for the youth in Townsville is one of the highest in the world. And this building, I'm not sure what my involvement with it looks like at this point, but this building will provide potentially a dance studio or registered with the Australian government training courses where kids can learn how to be mechanics or develop property and construction, or we'll have a weightlifting facility. Maybe I'll be involved in that a little bit. We'll have an auto body shop, or potentially we can have a dance studio as well. And so many options. I'm excited to see what God will do that. But that's just, so I've named to the campus where I did my training from, and I've named the youth precinct. And so YWAM all over the world is doing such great things, but YWAM Townsville has their fingers in a lot of different ministries. Like the medical ship. There's a photo of it on the prayer card, which I'll tell you about at the end. And there's just too much for me to explain to you about what we do. So I'll show you a couple things, and hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea of what it's like to be involved with this ministry. And so this is the medical side of things, and then I'll tell you what my role in all of this looks like more specifically.
I've been involved now for over 30 years, and really it comes back to we want to help people, and so many people don't have the opportunity at basic healthcare or training, and it's just such a privilege because the true value, the true resource, the true goal is within the information that I've been giving. This is people.
One of the things I love most about the apprenticeship is seeing young Papua New Guineans engaged. Seeing young, passionate Papua New Guineans from urban cities able to come out into rural context, building their nation.
When I think of the message I want to give, it's like we like in life. I want life and for you and for me, just to have life and living to the fullest.
We look despair in the eye and we say, do not have the final word. We're people who have our fingerprints on the torch of hope. That's Papua New Guinean fingerprints, Australian fingerprints, fingerprints from all around the world that press forward because we want to live.
So that gives you an idea of just one part of what we do and how large it is. And so YWAM Townsville has 200 people at any given time, about 150 on staff like me now, and then 50 students that cycle in and out. And so we have the training campus, which I originally talked about, and the new youth precinct, and the SHIP as well. And so 200 people run all of that with no salary, and we really don't understand how. It just keeps happening, and it keeps growing as well, which is super cool to watch and to be a part of. And the idea that I am a part of it is actually extraordinary to me. I don't really understand how I'm trusted with the things that I do. Okay, and so let's talk about what it is that I actually do. So the first time that I was gone in 2018 was as a student, and then I was back for the end of that year, and I've been there for all of 2019 now. And I've been working in the very office that Lloyd originally called me from. When I received that first phone call and the explanation of what this DTS thing was, and actually the tipping point that brought me there was those phone calls and that personal relationship. And so I have been able to do that exact same thing, not just for random people, but specifically for the students who will be arriving this coming October for that DTS, which I will be involved in. And more to come on that later. But also, in that position, in that office, I'm responsible for registering all of these students' visas to come into the country, as well as their healthcare plans. And so you look at these three ministries I've mentioned and 200 people, and all of these jobs need to be accomplished. Of course, there needs to be a base director and a captain of the ship to sail it, and someone needs to make lunch and dinner, and someone needs to clean the bathrooms. And so this is just the part that I get to play. But why would I do this job, or why would I try my best at this job, is a totally viable question to be asking. And so it reminds me of a story growing up with my family. And so the correlation I'm trying to make here is good things require work. And so for this ministry, which I consider to be good, a lot of work needs to go into it. And I see that same correlation in the property that I got to grow up on. Thanks, Mom and Dad. We had 2 different properties that both shared in that they were very large. There was room to grow and stretch and to ride our motorcycles from the front yard to the backyard and annoy the neighbors. There was a forest and lots of maintenance that had to come with all of these things, right? Because good things can require work when we're talking about these physical things that need to be accomplished. And so for this good property, every Saturday was work day. If you weren't up early on a Saturday morning, Dad would wake you up quite promptly, and we knew that we needed to rake the leaves, and we needed to scoop the dog poop and then mow the grass. And if you got those 2 in reverse order, it was not a good Saturday. And then every once in a while, a big project would come along, a big chore, but would ultimately add to the fact that this was a good thing. So a fence needed to be built, good. keeps the dogs in. One day, our neighbors nudged us on the shoulder and said, "This tree that's on your side of the fence, when the wind blows, sometimes it's starting to lean towards our roof, and sometimes it's leaning towards your roof, and so this needs to be taken care of because it's on your side of the fence." And Dad said, "You're right. I could pay to have that done, or Ian." And I was trusted with some serious responsibility right here. And so I found myself in the basket of a handmade telehandler, which is like a forklift with an arm that goes up 50 feet in the air. And I had a hard hat on my head, and I had a vest, which was clipped onto the cage of this handmade rig, and a chainsaw in my hand, and I was going up just to the 50-foot mark, which is halfway up this 100-foot tree, which is at our house here in Silverton. And we'd cleaned up all the branches, and we'd prepared really well. Like I had the tool. I knew how to operate a chainsaw for the most part. I'd even watched 3 YouTube videos on how to fell a tree. And so I was prepared. I was ready for what this responsibility that I was handed might look like. And so I began to cut, and there were big bark chips flying in my face, and the cut was looking a little bit uneven, like it was leaning a little bit too much towards our house, but I guess that's better than the neighbor's house. I know these people, I don't know them. And so it was time for me to put my hardest into what I was doing, to put effort into excellence. And that's something that I do in work at my house as well. And so this tree cracked, and it lost enough support that you knew it was only going one direction from there, and that direction was no longer up to me. And so as I look up from my viewpoint in the basket, parallel to the fence is 0 degrees, and it would be okay if it fell parallel to the fence. And then about 15 degrees, all in there is safe. Here we're hitting our porch, here we're hitting my bedroom. And so my target was slim, and I knew where it needed to fall, 0 and 15 degrees. And it landed on 7.5. Sorry about your blueberry bush, Mom. And I descended from the crane, cheering and hollering, and when I got back onto the ground there, I felt like, oh, I have ownership in this place. Like I've put my fingerprints on this property, and this thing that I consider to be quite good, I now want to deal with responsibly. So here's a little bit of video proof about what happened. My dad later confesses that he was just afraid of heights. And so now I find myself in an office, and so usually when you picture a missionary, they're not sitting in an office. I sit on a yoga ball. That's not usually what you would think of with a missionary, but I've been trusted with people's visas and healthcare, and potentially this deciding conversation about will you come and do this really cool thing that God has set up for us to be a part of. And I'm honored that I'm trusted with so much. Every day, they don't check my work and they don't deduct my pay if I do it poorly. They trust me to do things with excellence, which makes me feel very respected and therefore reciprocate respect. And actually, my boss in this office, his name is Lloyd. He's a really cool guy. I've spent a lot of time with him in the last year and a half, and he's poured into me a lot. You can tell he likes hanging out with me just as much as I like hanging out with him. He's one of my best friends now. And I'm really honored that he actually chose me specifically for his school, because when I was being called by him, he was making contact with his students who would come on the April 2018 Discipleship Training School. And now he's going to lead another one in October 2019, October Discipleship Training School. And so he asked me from the start of the time that I arrived there, will you be my contact person and have these conversations and help me in the office in this manner so that when the next step comes, they've built relationship with you and we can continue to lead these people well and to be at these people's disposal once they arrive, which is an extremely honoring thing for him to ask of me. I've been trusted with, well, let me tell you, I don't have a college degree in any of this. I didn't know how to make visas until it was time to do the first person's visa. And it's really honoring to be in this position. And so thank you, Lloyd, for trusting me. And I also want to say Thank you for my parents for trusting me and sending me across the world and loosening your grip so that I can do what I believe God has called me to do at this stage in my life. There's no way you could have done better at releasing me. You want me to stay, but you would rather have me go, and I'm just so thankful to be raised by the two of you, and you have done a fantastic job, and I love you. And so in this position in the comms office, it doesn't look like I have spent some time in Papua New Guinea, 6 weeks last year, doing missionary work of that sense. But when people understand that I'm actually working in an office right now, with plenty of other opportunities to serve outside of the regular hours and on weekends and stuff, they say, but like, how are you continuing to grow? Because that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, sitting on a yoga ball versus preaching in a village that doesn't have electricity. And it's a valid question to ask, and it reminds me of this story where I really just also couldn't understand at the start. And so I've been playing music since October. My parents bought me a guitar, and it was a lovely gift, and so I started to teach myself how to play guitar. And my whole life, my whole family, minus a saxophone player here and there, have considered ourselves to be unmusical. I can't sing, and I never naturally understood these things, and it didn't make much sense to me. So I wrote it off until October. I began to teach myself guitar. And really slowly, but steadily, I was like, this makes sense. It actually makes a lot of sense. There's a pattern here. Whole step, half step. And it's all lined up in a way that's actually repeatable. It's not just feelings, and if it sounds good, like you can do music that way and it's fine, but actually this can line up with how Ian thinks as well. And so I took a lot of interest in that. And then there's jazz. Jazz is just wrong. It's like music, where you have this pattern that's sequential and always the same, and then you change it, and you make one of the right pieces wrong. And so because I knew that, because I looked at the patterns and I study things in that way, where I want things to make sense to me, I looked at jazz and I said, this is bad. And then when I heard jazz in my ear, I said, this is bad. This is just wrong. Stop playing jazz. I would actually ask people to turn the jazz off and to pick classical music or something that lined up with the things that I was learning. And so jazz was my worst enemy. Until Lloyd, we can throw this lovely picture. Seriously, he does like spending time with me, even if you don't believe it based on the picture. Until Lloyd, brought out a guitar one evening, and he played a few chords of jazz. And I said, that's kind of cool. I respect Lloyd, so maybe I gave him a second chance. But it sounded good for a second. And it made me say, okay, maybe these beliefs that I hold aren't as concrete as I think they are. I went back to my room. I was doing homework that night. My guitar was on the other side of the room. And I've been spending like an hour a day with a guitar in my hands. And so I picked it up. It was just comfortable, and I thought that I would do a little bit of music theory research on jazz. And so in my head, you have like a triad chord. Some of you will track with these terms, and it doesn't matter if you don't. And you have your 1 note, your 3 note, and your 5 note, and makes a chord. And that's the simple way that I'm learning it, and it's making sense to me, so don't mess it up in my head. And then in my head, you just take one of those and you change them, and you make it jazz. But actually, as I'm looking at these things, they were keeping the 1, the 3, and the 5, and then it was just the extras that they were adding different bits of flavor to. And actually the structure was still there, and people were just appreciating addition to what I could comprehend at this time. And so a flip happened in my head. Whoa, like this does make sense. It's a lot harder to understand. I might not be ready for it, but jazz actually, it makes sense. And so I realized jazz did not change in that moment. Jazz had always been the same since I realized I liked it and didn't like it, and now I might like it again. Jazz never changed, but my perception of these things was being altered based on the way that I was walking through life. And I thought that was pretty cool. So I told my friends and coworkers about it in the office the next day, because we kind of get together each morning and say, I'm doing well or I'm not doing well. And so I wanted to tell them this exciting story about jazz. And then around the office, this one girl, she opened up that morning and said, I'm actually doing really bad. I don't know why, but I keep just making bad decisions and my life circumstances are not great. And immediately in my head, the same way I've been dealing with this girl for the half of a year that I've known her, I said, well, it's because you're doing X, Y, and Z. That's why your situation is bad. And then God spoke to me. In the same way I got those images in my head, he said, Ian, she's not wrong, she's just Jazz. You don't get her, and she's not the problem in this issue, but you've completely written her off, and you don't understand her. And that's something that you and I can work with. You don't need to work on changing her. And that was profound to me. So in situations like this, I can still work in an office and be transformed in my mind by God, just because he's gotten my attention at this point, and I know that it's worth it, which is extremely cool to hear me speak about, but it's a whole other thing to experience in your mind, because my words can only do so good of a job, but God is perfect at transformation. And so the way of my thoughts and the way that I consider other people and have love for them is in the process of completely transforming. And there's nothing I would rather spend this time doing. And so YWAM just kind of, I get to be in this environment where I'm setting up people's visas and serving, helping to construct the youth precinct as accommodation. Good things are being accomplished, but at the same time, God is at work in my life. And I'm surrounded by people who are doing the same thing, people who are keen to see what God will do in their lives and are asking him that question, what will you do, God? Every day. It's just a church. The Bible talks about church. Sunday morning church service is church, sure, but a community of believers living together and sharing with one another their things as well as their experiences and building one another up. This was the first church I let myself be planted inside of, and it has been nothing but extremely healthy for me to be a part of, which is just such a blessing. And so, like I said, that school's starting in October. So real quick, when I go back next Thursday to Australia, my life's going to be changing very rapidly. I'm going to be helping to staff this school, just like the school that I had been on last year. And so what that means is really simple. I'm just like a support character. So I'll organize financial and like transportation and outreach locations and all of that. But like I'm there in the lecture room with the students, and I'm there to support them in what they're going through and chat with them and provide them with resources or conversation or prayer or whatever it may be. And it blows my mind, just like the tree, that I'm trusted to be in this position, because I know how substantial Lloyd was and the other staff members of my school in my own walk with God, and so that I'm being trusted with that same responsibility is profound in my mind. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue doing that. And I've been doing that as a staff member 7.5 months now, and thank you, because I can't do this on my own. I do have expenses and I don't get paid, and so I'm fully funded at this point. Each month I receive $600 from people who also believe in what I'm doing. A lot of you are here in this room. One's in Sweden. A couple other people who just have asked God, is this a way you desire for me to take part in missionary work with you through supporting me? And so that's a really interesting way to look at it, would be like, if we are the body of Christ, which you've all heard the analogy of, and there are many different parts with different functions, and then maybe the arm or maybe just the very fingertip is a missionary that goes out and touches something far away, right? But it needs an arm and a shoulder and all these other things to get there. Or even just like a vein, a really simple part of the body that you might forget about, is supplying blood and like the life source of what's actually allowing this to happen. And so thank you for everyone who's been supporting me. And like I said, I am supported with what money I received for the month of August. I paid off all of the debt before coming here to us back from Australia real quick, and I have a few $100s waiting for me when I get back, which is lovely. And to staff this school will be $1,700 to $2,500 US, and I'm just curious to see how God will provide all of it. Long term, I would just love to see how God develops the youth precinct and how he develops these many things that he's hinted at and good things have already come from. But I just want to be involved with God. And so I don't know what comes after 2021 when when the commitment that I've made with YWAM ends. I don't know what's next, but I want to continue in God's things, not just good things or helping people, but specifically what God will have me do in that time is what I would like to be a part of. And so, of course, I need to be supported to do that mainly in prayer. God has revolutionized my idea of prayer in the last 6 weeks. There have been some crazy stories and experiences that have come from that I'll spare you of at the moment, but would love to tell you in person. And so I printed out some cards, which just have my contact information. There are some on the table that we'll get to a little bit later, but a different card is waiting for you at this long table that I would like for you to take home with you. It just has contact information, and it's pictures of me reminding you to pray for me if it's on your heart. And I would love to invite you guys to sponsor me in that way. It's just fantastic. And so pick one up as well as a magnet. You can put it on your fridge if you like. But thank you, all of you, for coming here and listening to me. Maybe it makes sense. Maybe a lot of it is still super confusing. But I'm just really glad to have these opportunities and to be quite sure that I'm in the place that God has in store for me at this point. And so I trust that some seeds are being sown through me, but God's up to some things that I couldn't possibly relay to all of you in my own stories. So I'm glad to be back here just real quickly and would love to catch up with all of you. Like, there's contact information on those cards, and on this card, which Brian will explain to you as he comes up, you can sign up for a newsletter as well and receive updates from me. And I would love to just stay in contact and relationship with many of you, because I have been and will be spending lots of time far away, but this is the home that I grew up in, and I want to know what's going on. And so there's a great opportunity for us to start some new relationships and carry on some really good ones. So thank you for listening to these abbreviations of what God has been up to, and I hope that you're all blessed to be here like I'm blessed to be able to share it with you. And so Brian will come on up and explain the cards that are on your table, and we'll conclude this night. But I'll be around, and you can come grab me and say a quick word. But I'll hand it to Brian just for a moment, and we'll